word Genesis means in the beginning, and it tells a story of the creation of the world.
Perhaps the most intriguing is the one that involves the Garden of Eden.
She was 940 years old, blind, dying, and yet she spoke with perfect clarity. Eve, the first woman, the mother of all humanity, left a final testimony hidden for over a millennium. How could a woman remember the very moment paradise collapsed around her? Not in the Bible, you know, not in the story you were taught, but in a lost Ethiopian manuscript. She spoke of floods and fire, and of a child who would one day unlock the gates of Eden itself. Could humanity survive what she foretold? This is the secret history of our world, and it is about to be revealed. Ancient Eve manuscript high in the Simeon Mountains of northern Ethiopia, carved into cliff faces and perched on the edges of canyons.
Welcome to the Simeon Mountains in Ethiopia. I just got here and we're going to be hiking along here for the next 2 days.
That drop 1,000 feet into shadow. There are monasteries older than most European nations. Debre Damo, Abuna Yemata Gu, places you can only reach by climbing a rope up a sheer rock wall. Places that were built not for convenience, but for secrecy. Inside those monasteries, monks have guarded manuscripts for centuries, texts written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that most people in the world have never even heard of.
Ancient scrolls with texts in Greek and Latin. Entombed in volcanic ash for hundreds of years.
Some of these manuscripts contain books that never made it into the Western Bible. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the one we're here to talk about today, a text known as the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. Now let's be honest, that title alone should make you stop and pay attention, because this isn't a brief addendum to Genesis. This is a massive, sprawling narrative, sometimes called the first and second book of Adam and Eve. And it tells a version of humanity's origin story that is rawer, stranger, and more emotionally devastating than anything you'll find in the traditional biblical canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved this text as part of its broader scriptural tradition for centuries.
Scenes of a united Ethiopian Orthodox Church after weeks of tension and unrest. Visuals like this one in Addis Ababa are a show of strength for one of the oldest Christian bodies in the world.
While Western Christianity narrowed its canon during the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, Ethiopia kept its library wide open. They didn't throw these books away. They didn't burn them. They copied them by hand, generation after generation, on sheets of goatskin parchment, by candlelight, in monasteries where the air is so thin your lungs ache just from breathing. Western scholars didn't encounter these texts in any serious way until the 18th and 19th centuries, when European explorers and missionaries began cataloguing Ethiopian religious manuscripts. And even then, most academics treated them as curiosities, folk religion, apocrypha, interesting but not authoritative. But here's the thing about dismissing a text that's been faithfully preserved for over a millennium by people who literally risked their lives to protect it. It says more about the person doing the dismissing than it does about the text. Because this manuscript contains something remarkable. It contains Eve's voice, not a passing mention, not a footnote. Eve speaks. She remembers, she grieves, she prophesies. In a religious tradition where women's voices have been systematically silenced for centuries, this Ethiopian scroll gives the first woman her own testimony. And it does so in extraordinary detail. And it's the final chapters of this text, the ones describing Eve's last days on earth, that contain some of the most haunting, beautiful, and deeply unsettling passages in all of ancient religious literature. Let me take you there. The last witness of the garden. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine something you've never actually seen. Not a garden, not a park, not even the most beautiful forest on earth. Imagine a place where light doesn't come from the sun. It comes from everything. The ground pulses with it. The leaves breathe it. The water doesn't just reflect light, it generates it. Like every river is a vein carrying liquid fire through the body of the world. That's what Eve described, according to the conflict of Adam and Eve. When Eve spoke about Eden in her final days, she didn't talk about it like a place she visited. She talked about it like a world she had been torn from. And the details she gave were not vague. They were painfully specific. She spoke of a living light, not sunlight, not moonlight. Something else entirely. A radiance that surrounded her and Adam like a garment. The text describes it as a garment of glory, a kind of luminous covering that wrapped their bodies before the fall. They didn't need clothes because they were clothed in light itself. It wasn't metaphor. In the text, this light is physical, tangible. When they sinned, it was stripped from them, and that's when they first felt cold. That's when they first felt exposed. But because the light that had always held them simply left. Eve remembered the rivers, 4 of them, flowing from a single source at the center of the garden, and these weren't ordinary rivers. The text suggests they carried something more than water, a kind of spiritual nourishment that sustained everything they touched. Trees didn't just grow near these rivers, they flourished in ways that defy natural description, perpetually bearing fruit, perpetually in bloom, as if the concept of seasons hadn't been invented yet. And then there was the tree of life. Eve described it with a kind of longing that reaches across the centuries and grabs you by the chest. It stood at the heart of the garden, and its presence was so overwhelming that everything else oriented around it. The rivers flowed toward it. The animals rested beneath it. The light seemed to emanate from it. It wasn't just a tree. It was the anchor of paradise. And when Adam and Eve were cast out, they didn't just lose access to a garden. They lost access to the source of life itself. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail in Eve's testimony is what she said about the animals. In Eden, there was no fear. Not between humans and animals. Not between predators and prey. The lion didn't hunt. The serpent didn't strike. Every creature existed in a state of mutual recognition. They knew Adam and Adam and Eve knew them. Eve described a world where a wolf would lie beside a lamb, not because it had been trained to, but because the very concept of violence hadn't entered creation yet. And then she described the moment the animals turned away. After the fall, according to this text, the animals no longer recognized Adam and Eve. The creatures that had once approached them with trust now fled or snarled. The bond was broken. And Eve, remembering this 900 years later, still wept. Think about that for a moment. 9 centuries of life, and she still carried the grief of that broken connection. Not with God, not with paradise in the abstract, but with the animals. With the wolves and the birds and the creatures that had once known her name and now looked at her, with nothing but fear. That's not theology, that's heartbreak. And it's the kind of detail you only get from a text that was written by someone who understood loss at its deepest level. The vision of Adam's soul. Now, before we get to Eve's final prophecy, we need to talk about what happened when Adam died. Because according to this text, Eve didn't just witness Adam's death, she witnessed something far more terrifying and far more beautiful. She saw his soul leave his body, and what she described reads less like ancient scripture and more like a scene from a film that hasn't been made yet. Adam died at the age of 930. The text tells us he had been ill, weakened, his body failing in a way it was never originally designed to do. Because remember, in this tradition, death itself was not part of the original plan. Death was the consequence, the invasion, the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. When Adam took his last breath, Eve was beside him. And in that moment, she saw the sky split open. Not figuratively. The text describes it with startling physicality. The heavens parted like a curtain being drawn, and through the opening Eve saw a chariot of light descending. A heavenly vehicle surrounded by fire, driven by beings she could barely comprehend. These were not gentle cherubs with harps. These were archangels, Michael, Gabriel, and others, towering figures radiating power, their faces almost impossible to look at directly. They came for Adam's soul. The text describes the archangels lifting Adam's spirit from his body with a tenderness that seems almost contradictory to their terrifying appearance. They handled his soul the way you might handle a wounded bird, carefully, reverently, as if it were the most fragile and precious thing in all of creation. Because in a sense, it was. This was the first human soul, the prototype, the original. And then came the lake. According to Eve's vision, the archangels carried Adam's soul to a body of water, a cleansing lake somewhere beyond the visible sky. The text calls it a place of purification, and when Adam's soul was immersed in it, something extraordinary happened. The darkness that had clung to him, the stain of the fall, the weight of 900 years of guilt and grief, began to dissolve, and in its place something returned. The light, the same garment of glory that had been stripped from him in Eden, began to reconstitute around his soul. Not fully, the text is careful about that, but enough. Enough to suggest that the damage wasn't permanent, enough to suggest that what was lost could eventually be restored. Eve watched all of this. She saw her husband's soul carried into the heavens, washed clean and partially restored to the glory they had both lost. And when the vision ended and the sky closed again and she was left standing beside his lifeless body in a dark cave in a fallen world, she understood something that would shape everything she said and did in the time she had left. She understood that death was not the end, it was a door, and what lay on the other side of that door was not punishment. It was a restoration. Eve's final prophecy. After Adam's death, Eve knew her time was limited. The text tells us she could feel it, not just the weight of age, but a pull, like the earth itself was gently calling her home. And before she answered that call, she had something to say. She gathered her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. By this point, the text implies there were many, generations upon generations spreading out across the land. Seth was there. So were his children and theirs. They came to her because they sensed what was happening. The first mother was dying, and she wanted to speak. And what she told them was not a bedtime story. It was a warning. Eve prophesied that a great flood was coming. Not soon, not in their lifetimes, but eventually, inevitably, the world they knew, the ground they walked on, the mountains they could see from the mouth of their cave, all of it would be swallowed by water. God would look at what humanity had become and decide to start again. And when that water rose, almost everything would be lost. But the flood, she said, was not the end. After the water, there would come fire, a second purification, fiercer than the first. The text frames this not as revenge, but as refining, the way a goldsmith uses fire to burn away impurities and reveal the pure metal underneath. The earth itself would be cleansed, not destroyed, transformed, not discarded. And Eve spoke of this future fire with a strange calm, as if she understood that destruction and creation were, in God's hands, the same gesture. But here is where Eve's prophecy reaches its crescendo, the part that made her descendants lean in close, that made the cave go silent, that echoes across the centuries with a weight that still hasn't fully settled. She told them about the promised one, a descendant, her descendant, a child born from her bloodline, not immediately, but after ages upon ages of waiting. This promised one would do what neither she nor Adam could do. He would face the same enemy that had destroyed them in the garden. He would confront the serpent, the deceiver, the voice that had whispered from the branches of the forbidden tree, and he would win. More than that, this promised descendant would open the gates of Eden again. Let that sink in. Eve, on her deathbed, is not just predicting a savior. She's predicting a homecoming. She's saying that everything they lost, the light, the rivers, the tree of life, the animals that knew their names, all of it would be accessible again. The exile was not permanent. The story was not over. The garden was still there, somewhere, waiting. And Eve, who had been there, who had walked under that impossible light, who had touched the bark of the tree of life with her own hands, she was the only person alive who truly understood what that promise meant. She wasn't speaking in abstractions. She was describing a real place, a place she remembered with every cell of her ancient failing body. The text tells us her children wept. Not the quiet, dignified weeping of a funeral, the deep, shaking sobs of people who suddenly understand the full scope of what was lost and the almost unbearable hope of what might be regained. Eve held them. She held as many as she could reach, and she told them to write it down, write everything down, because the flood would come and memory would drown with the dead, and if the promise was going to survive, it had to be carved into something that water couldn't wash away. According to the text, that's exactly what they did. They inscribed her words on tablets of stone and pillars, one of stone, one of brick, so that no matter what came, fire or water, something would survive. Eden's hidden legacy, Eve, died 6 days after delivering her prophecy. The text doesn't dramatize it. It doesn't give us a grand speech at the moment of death or a cinematic final breath. It simply says she lay down, commended her soul to God, and was gone. After 940 years, the first woman closed her eyes for the last time. And the world, the fallen, broken, grieving world, was now without either of its original witnesses. But what happened next is something you need to understand, because it connects to one of the most extraordinary threads running through ancient religious history. A thread that stretches from this moment all the way to Bethlehem, to Golgotha, and beyond. Her children carried her body to the Cave of Treasures. Now, this cave is not some vague, symbolic location invented for the sake of storytelling. The Cave of Treasures, known in Syriac as Me'arath Gaze, in Arabic as Ma'ara al-Kanuz, and in the Ethiopian Ge'ez language as Ba'ata Mazagabet, is one of the most referenced locations in all of ancient Near Eastern Christian literature. It appears not only in the conflict of Adam and Eve, but also in a separate Syriac manuscript bearing its name, the Book of the Cave of Treasures, a text that scholars believe was composed no later than the 6th or 7th century and possibly earlier. August Dillmann, the German scholar who studied these texts in the 1850s, demonstrated that entire sections of the Ethiopian conflict of Adam and Eve and the Syriac Cave of Treasures were virtually identical, evidence of a shared ancient source that predates both versions. The cave wasn't just a burial site. According to the tradition, it was where Adam and Eve had lived after their exile from Eden. It was dark, cold, and suffocating, the opposite of everything they had known in the garden. The text describes how God sent birds and beasts to the cave when Adam and Eve first arrived, commanding the animals to be friendly to them. But the cave remained a place of mourning. It was where they had prayed, where they had starved, where Adam had wept so hard that the ground beneath his face was wet with tears, and it was where eventually Adam's body had been laid to rest. But the cave held something else, something physical, something real within the world of the text. When God expelled Adam and Eve from Eden, 3 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, were sent to deliver 3 gifts from the garden: 70 rods of gold from the Indian Sea, 12 pounds of incense from the eastern border of Eden, and 3 pounds of myrrh from the western border, where, the text says, bitterness first came upon Adam. These weren't random tokens. God told Adam directly that these 3 gifts were prophetic symbols. The gold represented a coming kingdom, the incense represented divinity, and the myrrh represented suffering and death. God said that one day, kings would bring these same gifts to him when he came in the flesh. Think about that. Centuries before, the Gospel of Matthew described wise men bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh to a child born in Bethlehem. This Ethiopian text claims those exact gifts had been in Adam's cave since the beginning of human history. The same gifts, the same symbolism, waiting. Adam, on his deathbed, had instructed his son Seth to guard these treasures and never let them leave the cave. And according to the broader tradition found in both the conflict of Adam and Eve and the Syriac Cave of Treasures, those gifts remained in the cave through every generation, until Noah. Before the flood, Noah was commanded to carry Adam's body and the 3 treasures aboard the ark. After the waters receded, Shem and Melchizedek, guided by an angel, transported Adam's remains and the treasures to a hill described in the text as the center of the earth. The same hill where, the tradition insists, Christ would one day be crucified directly above the skull of the first man. That is what was inside the cave when Eve's children carried her body to its entrance. They placed her beside Adam, and the text describes this with a tenderness that transcends time and culture and theology. The first husband and the first wife together again. Not in Eden, not in the light, not in the garden they had lost, but in a dark cave in a wounded world, side by side, surrounded by gold that glowed faintly in the darkness, incense that still carried a trace of paradise, and myrrh that smelled of sorrow and of a promise not yet fulfilled. The text calls it a kind of marriage, a marriage of the grave, and there's something in that phrase that cuts deeper than almost anything else in this entire story. Because marriage, in this tradition, began in paradise. It began in light and perfection and joy. And now it ends here, in stone and shadow and silence. The full arc of human love, from garden to grave, compressed into two bodies lying side by side in a cave that smells of earth and time and something ancient that no one alive can name. But then something happened that nobody expected. A fragrance. The text tells us that when Eve was laid beside Adam, a scent began to fill the cave. Not the smell of death, not the smell of earth or decay. Something else. Something sweet, something impossibly achingly familiar. A fragrance that had no source in the physical world, that couldn't be traced to any flower or herb or incense, not even the incense already resting in the cave. It spread beyond the cave. It drifted out through the entrance and across the land, carried by a wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And the people who smelled it, Adam and Eve's descendants, scattered across the surrounding hills and valleys, they stopped what they were doing. They looked up, and they knew. The fragrance, the text implies, was Eden itself reaching through the veil, not the garden itself, not a portal or a doorway, but a memory made physical, a trace of the place that still existed somewhere beyond the edges of the fallen world, reminding humanity that it was real, that it had happened, that the light and the rivers and the tree and the animals that knew your name, all of it was still there, still waiting. The same way the gold and incense and myrrh were still waiting in that cave for a journey they would one day make, to a manger, to a king, to the fulfillment of everything Eve had spoken with her last breath. And then the fragrance faded. And the cave was just a cave. And the world went on. But the treasures remained. And the promise remained. And the story, carved into stone, copied onto goatskin, preserved in cliffside monasteries for centuries upon centuries, that story refused to die. The words of Eve have survived millennia, hidden in mountains, carried across deserts, preserved against war and time. But why? Were they merely stories or warnings meant for a future we are only now entering? If her testimony speaks of a promise or a reckoning, what does that mean for us today, standing in the shadow of a world that has forgotten the garden? The manuscript waits, silent but patient. The question is not whether the story is true, but whether we are ready to understand what comes next.